Next up, we have one of our current backend students, Bavana.
I'm currently talking about something that's very new to me. My husband introduced me to this concept called OAuth, where generally it's sort of like you're talking about a concept that didn't exist even 10 years ago. So it's almost like very, very new, where people are starting to think about how to take how to provide this service or provide a framework or rules to let everybody take this into apply this into all the applications that they're building. So anybody who has used the internet would have come across a page that is similar to this, where you would be probably like redirected, like if you're like me, you wouldn't want to sit and fill up your details every single time you are trying to log into a website. So this is a classic example of a redirect page where it just says, okay, we are here. And if you are already on Gmail or one of these other partnership servers or services that you're using, then you can use their credentials that you have used to log into their account, and you can get in to our let us use all of that to let other people know what's happening. So this is where OAuth comes in. OAuth is a framework, like it's a set of rules for ID assertion and authorization, and that's all it is. There's no, everything that comes after this is pretty much, it's sort of like, let's say you want to follow, you want to be a British citizen, you have to follow certain rules. And that is all this is. This is an authority giving you a certain number of rules to follow. So in OAuth, you have 4 types of grants. The user authorization grant, which almost all of us come across. Then you have a client authorization grant type, which is something that happens between services to services. This has nothing to do with the user as you at the endpoint. And then you have something called the implicit and grant point, which is terribly, terribly bad from a security point of view. And the resource owner grant type, which is again similar to the implicit grant type, but it has a few things that are a bit more customizable. But again, implicit grant type and resource owner grant types are really, really like almost a no-no when you think about trying to share your information online. Now, some of the OAuth terminologies that we come across, they are used, and almost like this took a long time for me to actually understand and go through, because they use specific stuff for specific things. Resource owner is you as a person at the endpoint who's making the request. And then the client would be the client. For example, if you have Airbnb that you go into and they make a request to Google or whoever you want to use credentials from, so the client would be Airbnb at that point. And then you have an authorization server. This can be part of the resource server, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be. Some services which are too small tend to use a third-party authorization server. Now, an authorization server is more or less an authority that gives you papers. For example, if you want to travel to another country from Britain, you take your passport with you. The person on the other end sitting at immigration doesn't have to trust you as a person, but they look at your papers, they look at your passport and say, oh, you're a British citizen, it's issued by an authority in Britain. So that is what they trust. So this is what an authentication server essentially does. Now, the resource server is what you want the resources from. From when you develop, like when you ask as a client for resources, if you're on Airbnb and you ask for Google to share its contacts with you, like as a user, you want Google to share all its contacts so you can send advertisement messages or some kind of message on behalf of you to your contacts, then this would become your resource server. Like Google will become your resource server and Airbnb will become the client. So the redirect URL is very interesting because this is something that none of us see happening in the front. It's almost like a back channel thing where certain countries, for example, just to bring it into more current day scenarios, like there are some countries that you can travel to without a visa. So if we take something like that into consideration, now they look at your passport and they authorize you saying, okay, so this is an understanding made between the two countries. It has nothing to do with you as a citizen of the country or the other person, but it's already made between the two countries and the authority sitting behind. So this kind of agreement that they have is like, it helps with letting you know that like you take the passport to them and then they just let you in based on this. So the redirect URL is almost like this piece of passport or this piece of thing that one of the authorities has given you and you take it to them. So this happens behind. So when you click on something like, when we go further, I will explain a bit more. And then you have response type. This response type and scope are different types of responses you get back. And the consent authorization will be something similar to this. Like the response type will have a scope and consent authorization from the client. So it's almost like working hand in hand. Then you have the client ID and client secret. Client secret is a secret. Like, for example, if you have a mailbox, anybody can post things into it. But without a key, you cannot open this mailbox. It's similar to that. And then you have an authorization code, which I will explain in a little bit, and the access token. This is a very simplified, like a swim lane diagram of what OAuth is. You have your application. It sends a request to the authorization server. And then, so you as a person are using this application to send the request. This application is sending the request on your behalf. And everything in dotted lines is what happens behind on the back channel. So the authorization code is sent back to your application and the exchange token. So this is like a very simplified version of what happens before, like almost like a very, very stylized version of what an OAuth server does. And then so basically, when you look at the different types of like as a client, this is another way of depicting the same diagram. That was swim lane, and this is just the flow of data, the way it goes. So the resource server and the authorization server have an agreement before, like with the client, saying, okay, and they give this like almost like a key to the client. So let me, like, it's just, I thought it would be interesting to see different ways of depicting. So there are so many different ways out there of depicting the exact same diagram. When you look at it, it's all the same thing. So now we're going to go into my very kindergarten version of how it looks. So you have a client, which will be you, and whatever website you're using. And then you go onto Airbnb and you say, okay, I want to create an account. Now they say, okay, I see you already have a Google account. Do you want me to use your Google credentials? And at that point, you say, oh, yes, I want to use the Google credentials to log into Airbnb. I don't want to sit and put all my details over again. So at that point, the client sends a redirect to Google. Like, this is what would have happened behind the scenes. So this redirect will already contain one of the client's keys. So it's almost like saying, okay, so I have a key. I'm not just a person, like random person asking for this, and this is my key, and you attach all of that, and then you send a redirect. So when you send a redirect, the Google sends back an authentication page saying, are you sure you want to do this? Is this you are the one asking for it? And at this point, the client says yes, and then he enters the credential, or they enter the credentials of like the username and the password to say, yes, this is me. At that point, Google sends back a message saying the authentication was successful, and it sends the consent required. So this consent is what it is that, like, it's very granular, almost like you can consent to pretty much everything. Like, this is where you click on, do you want Google to share all the contacts, or do you want Google to let Airbnb only take a look at these contacts? You can, as a client, specify how much authority you want to give Airbnb. Now, after this, you send like a you send a response with all of these things put into it back to Google. When all of this is done, after you're done selecting whatever you want with the response, Google sends back a redirection page or a redirection URL with like a reference token attached to this. So if you watch really close at the URL, like the URL bar, you will actually take a look at all of this happening in the background. Now, after all of this is done, you take that reference token. So Google takes this reference token, wraps it up nicely, and sends it to Airbnb. Now, because of all of this, and this reference token being sent to Airbnb, you don't have to have this process happening every time you go onto Airbnb. At the end, like when you look at it, I hope this kind of makes it a bit clear. I am sort of quite a nervous public speaker, so please excuse me. The client now, Yelp or Airbnb or Google, or I mean, like any of them, like even within Google, if you want to use certain microservices that they have, they probably will be having the same kind of channels happening or same kind of processes happening on the background. So you go through this is just the code flow, like the way the code works for the whole thing. The dotted lines are all the back channel code, and the front lines are solid arrows. So when you look at the solid arrows, these happen on your browser. So it's not necessarily the most secure way of handling information. This is why you need that secret code and all the tokens being passed on a back channel where it's not like easily published to everybody. Thank you. That's about it. These are my credits.